Good evening, Holmesville Church of Christ. Welcome back to our Sunday evening service. Glad you could join us for this evening as we continue to walk through the book of Hebrews together. Tonight we're going to be in chapter 11, verses 8 through 22. We did verses 1 through 7 last time, and we hope that all of you are either in a small group and that you're enjoying a great time together watching this and having a great discussion time afterwards, or if you're by yourself, we're glad that you've joined us too, and hopefully you can get something out of this message and look at the questions and have a great meditation and devotional time for yourself. But this Sunday evening, as we continue to look through the book of Hebrews, tonight we're going to look at these verses and see what we can learn from them. Just to give a quick review, the last few weeks we've been looking at the fact that Jesus is superior in every way. That's what the vast majority of the chapters were teaching us. And so then we got to a little transition, and the Hebrew writer says, because Jesus is so superior, now becomes the application, and that's what we've been into the last few weeks. And the application is, Jesus is so superior to everything, in everybody and in every way, we should draw near to Him, and we should endure through all our discouragements, through all the tough times. We should endure it and still be drawing near to Him. And now we've gotten into chapter 11, where it's telling us that we need to have faith. Having faith is extremely important, and so we looked at that last week about why it's so important, about why we need it, because it's the only way to please God. And so last week he defined what faith was. And so now we're into chapter 11, having defined what faith is, knowing we need it in our life in order to please God. We looked at the lessons that we can learn about building our faith. And he wants us to give, the Hebrew writer's wanting to give examples that we can look at, that we can learn from and say, man, I need to have faith like that. That our faith can learn from other folks in their faith. And the first one we looked at was Abel. And the fact that his faith was very strong, and that even though Cain killed Abel, his faith was a great example for all of us. We looked at Enoch and his great faith. We looked at Noah, and that's kind of where we left off from last week. So now we're going to be looking at verses 8 through 22 tonight, but let's start by looking at verses 8 through 10. Let's read this. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. So now the Hebrew writer gives us Abraham. We've gone through Noah and Enoch and Abel, but now he comes to Abraham, and he says, I defined faith for you earlier. Faith is proof, it is evidence of that which is not seen. And so he says the evidence here with Abraham is his obedience. Abraham's faith is evident in his life because of the fact that he was so obedient to God. It says, by faith Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as an inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. So he's saying, when God told Abraham to go, he obeyed. And so therefore he had faith. It's not like he just wanted to leave. It's not like he was trying to move. God told him to move, and he did. The obedience is the evidence of his faith. One thing I want to point out here I think is important to note also here, and I think it's kind of cool to note, is the fact that Abraham's faith was not always perfect. Even in this story that the Hebrew writer points out that Abraham, he went when he was told to go, even that it's not 100% exactly the way the story went. Yes, Abraham obeyed and he did go, but he was less than perfect in that obedience. In Acts chapter 7, verses 2 through 4, we're reminded that Abraham only went halfway. When God said, I want you to go from here to there, he went, but halfway through, he stopped for a while. He kind of pitched his tent and made a little home about halfway there for a little while and didn't want to leave there. It took him a while. It took some maturity. It took some time, but eventually Abraham did obey. It wasn't perfect. He settled in the land of Haran, says the Bible. He stayed there for a long time, but he did eventually obey completely. And that's what the Hebrew writer's trying to point out. The faith comes out. Even though we make mistakes along our way, even though our human errors get in the way sometimes, if we have our faith and we will eventually completely obey, then that's what's going to be remembered. And I think that's good news for all of us. Thousands of years later, God is not focused on the delayed obedience, but the faith that Abraham has. And I think that's what's coming out here in the Hebrew, from the Hebrew writer. He's praising Abraham, saying, look at his faith. By faith, he went from point A to point B because God told him to. And he doesn't even go beyond that. He doesn't even let us know of the whole story about how he had some hiccups along the way, how he had some faith, how he had some doubts in his faith along the way. Because that stuff is forgotten. When we obey completely, God says, I'll forgive all the mistakes you made. I'll forgive and I'll forget. I won't remember it any longer. I think that's good news for us. Many of us, we may make some mistakes, but if we get right down to it and we're fully obedient, eventually, God says, I'm going to forgive because of your faith. And so I think that's a great lesson in and of itself there, isn't it? The other thing to point out here is the fact that by faith, Abraham lived as a stranger in a foreign country. I think that's a hugely important lesson to remember there. Abraham saw himself as a sojourner, says some of your text, as an alien, someone who didn't belong. And I think that is a great example for us of how we need to be in our world today. Being a foreigner in a foreign country, you kind of stick out, don't you? You look different, you eat different, everything about you is different. You don't fit into the culture. And that's the way Abraham was. He was different in so many ways. He was different in his beliefs. He was different in his looks. He was different in the way he did his business. He was different in his daily lifestyle. He was a foreigner in this strange land. He was a sojourner. He stuck out. He was different. He knew in his mind, this is just a temporary residence. My permanent residence is going to be with God. And that's just like us. We need to have that same mindset. Folks, Lansing is not our home. Whatever your address is, it's not your home. Your home, your permanent residence is with God in heaven. As long as you have your faith and stick with Him, your permanent home is in heaven. We're just passing through for a few years on this temporary rock called earth. And that's what we need to be reminded of. And that's how, by faith, Abraham lived and did obedience to what God said. So now let's look at verses 11 through 12. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. All right, so let's talk about this. First of all, the Hebrew writer gives us Abraham, and now the Hebrew writer is giving us Sarah's faith. Sarah's faith is presented to us, and we're told of the story about how she was past childbearing age, but God promised to deliver him a child, and it happened. And it says by faith, she considered that. She considered him faithful to make that promise. Well, I think it's important to realize that Sarah's faith, in the same way Abraham's faith, her faith was not perfect either. If we can recall that story, she laughed at first. When God first gave her the promise that through Abraham and that they were going to have a child, she laughed at that. She did not believe that was possible. She's like, I'm way too old. Remember, she laughed at the whole concept of that. And so in that same lesson as Abraham, I think it's important to remind ourselves, God forgets our failings, doesn't he? He remembers our faith and where we end up. We may have dumb reactions at the beginning. We may have sinful reactions and sinful doubts along the way. But if we stick to it and eventually get to that point of faith, God forgets that. And he just considers us as people of faith. And that's exactly what we're seeing with Abraham and Sarah. Sarah laughed in the face of God when she was told that she was going to have this child. She didn't believe it, but she did come to a point of faith and accepted it. And because she acted in faith, as the scripture says, millions of descendants were born. Because she came to that point where her faith was finally strong in what God told her, then because of that, an entire nation of Israelites came to exist. And there's a great lesson for you there too. Faith can have impacts on generations to follow. A lot of times when you have faith, you don't even know how that's going to affect others. You don't know how that may affect generations and millions of people down the road. You don't know. All you're doing is living on faith, but it can affect so much. Your faith is not just about you. Think about, so many times people say, well, this is my faith. This is the way I believe. And it's about us, and we try to get inner focused with our faith, and we're missing the concept. I think one of the reasons Sarah is so important in her faith is because look how she affected millions and billions of people throughout history because her faith finally came to accept what God was telling her. That she was going to have this child, and she finally accepted that. Our faith is not just about us. There are people watching you. There are people you have influence over. There are people that you indirectly may affect by living your life. And so that is exactly the lesson that I think is so strong here with Sarah. You never know how your faith in obedience will impact others in their future. Let's look at verses 13 through 16. In verses 13 through 16, the text says, all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. So now we get to some more lessons about Abraham and Sarah's faith. The greatest lesson here that the Hebrew writer is trying to let us know is they died in faith. When Abraham and Sarah died, they had faith that the promises God told them were going to be received. Because when they died, they couldn't see it. When Abraham and Sarah died, they didn't see the millions that were promised. They didn't see the descendants like numbering the sands on the seashore. They couldn't see that. They couldn't envision it. They died without being able to see the promise, just believing it was going to come true because God said it. They died believing in the promise they never saw with their own eyes come true. They only knew in their heart it would come true because it was what God said. And so that's what the Hebrew writer is trying to say here, is when it comes to the point of death, you may not realize the effects your faith may have on other people. But God is telling you, God is just telling you to live a faithful life, and it will affect. It will help you, it will help others. And so if we die understanding God keeps his promises, then we don't have to worry about whether we see that or not. We just know it's going to happen. And that's how exactly Abraham and Sarah died. They died with full trust, knowing that God's promises were all going to come true, even though they did not see it. They knew that they were living in this temporary land, sojourners, aliens, a foreigner, like we talked about earlier. They knew they were in this temporary land, and they received the promises, knowing that they would not see those promises come true. They accepted it. They accepted the promises of God, and they lived knowing those promises were going to come true, and they were telling others, preaching to others, that is going to come true, even though they never saw it come true. They did so, and with faith they did so. And so therefore the text here says, because they lived like that, they died in that faith, knowing God's promise was going to come true even though when they couldn't see it, God is not going to be ashamed of them. Isn't that a powerful lesson? If we die knowing God is going to fulfill all His promises, and we have that belief in our heart that God, I may be done with this earth, but I believe everything you said is going to come true, then He says, I'm not going to be ashamed. I'm going to hold you in high regard. And I think the converse is also an important lesson. If we don't have faith and we die without that faith, then God is going to be ashamed of you. God is going to be ashamed of you, and He's going to say, depart from me, I never knew you. He only accepts you if you have faith. And I think that's a great lesson from those verses. Let's look at Hebrews 17 through 19. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead. So now in this section, Abraham's faith, the Hebrew writer lets us know, was so great that he believed God could raise the dead. That is something that I don't know if Abraham had ever seen that before, but he knew that God had that ability. And so he said, you gotta put yourself in Abraham's shoes. God said, I'm going to give you this son, and from him will come a nation of millions of people will be born through them. And the whole line of the Messiah, everything will come from Abraham's lineage. And God gave those promises. But now He's telling... So that's one command, but now He's telling Abraham to sacrifice his son on an altar. Those two don't make sense. Those two seem to contradict each other. You see Abraham saying, if I obey this command and kill my son on the altar, how in the world are the other commands going to, how are the promises from God going to come true? They're contradictory. They didn't make sense to Abraham. But Abraham, in faith, said, well, if I just do what God says, maybe He can raise him up from the dead. He has that kind of power. I just better do what God says no matter what. Because Abraham has faith that God would not contradict Himself. He starts to logically think, if I just do what God says here, He doesn't contradict Himself. He's going to figure out a way to handle the other. And so he is willing to do everything God says. So he obeyed God. He was willing to sacrifice his son because he said to himself, God is somehow, He's going to take care of those other promises He gave me. That's faith. That's faith. When you do something that doesn't make sense at all, having full trust that God will handle it. And that's exactly what Abraham did. Look at verse 20. And verse 20 says, by faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. Now this is an interesting story as well because, again, Isaac has some problems here. Again, all these people who are put forth to have all this kinds of faith, and yet when you look at the story, there's problems there. It says, by faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau. Well, if you remember right, if you remember that story, Isaac didn't want to bless Jacob. He didn't want to at all. He only wanted to bless Esau. Jacob had to trick Isaac into receiving the blessing. Remember, he got dressed up in the fur because Esau was a hairy guy and Isaac was losing his eyesight. Remember the whole story? And so Jacob had to trick him into getting the blessing. He stole Esau's blessing. Isaac was going to give the blessing to Esau. Jacob did this big trick and stole it. And so here the Hebrew writer phrases it in a weird way, like Isaac just happily blessed both of them. Well, I think the point here is that Isaac did. You see, Isaac, during during that time, he saw Esau as the more manly man, and so he wanted to bless Esau. He wanted to give him the birthright, but Isaac came in the place of faith about the situation. The point is there, Isaac, when he blessed Jacob, when he meant to bless Esau, but when he, by accident, blessed Jacob, what the Hebrew writer is trying to say here is Isaac came to a place where he said, okay, you know what? God's in charge. I wanted to bless Esau, but Jacob got the blessing instead. Well, that must be what God wanted then. That was kind of the reasoning by Isaac. He realized that Jacob receiving the blessing must have been God's plan. Because God, nothing happens by accident. It's kind of the concept here. Isaac finally in faith comes to a point where he says, Jacob didn't steal the blessing. God must have worked it out to where Jacob got the blessing. Isaac knew that he kind of made a weak attempt at trying to outsmart God because Jacob was supposed to get the blessing. And so he wanted to give it to Esau. He wanted to do something that was counter from God because he thought Esau's a better man. Esau's the manlier man. Esau's the man who I need to give the blessing to. He's trying to outsmart God. But Isaac finally comes to a point in his life, maybe after the situation, but still, he responded to that whole situation in faith and said, okay, God, you win. Jacob has the birthright and Esau will be blessed in his own way. He may not have got the birthright, he may not have got the special blessing, but he's going to be blessed in his own way, the way he should have been blessed. And so he just comes to this point of faith, saying, God, you're in charge. And so I bless both of my sons in the way they should have been because you directed everything. Isaac was not a sore loser. He didn't lose in that situation. That's not how he viewed it. Instead, he responded in faith. And I think that's a great challenge for us to see. And that's what is being pointed out here in this story. Let's look at verse 21 together. Verse 21 says, by faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. So now we look at Jacob's faith. Jacob, physically speaking, was so weak he had to lean on his staff at the end of his life here. Jacob was dying. Physically, he was in horrible shape. And yet the scripture says, even in that kind of shape, he was worshiping. He worshiped even in that physical shape. He was worshiping while he was on his deathbed, showing his faith and his dependence and his reliance on God. The whole point of the Hebrew writer pointing out this thing of Jacob is an interesting point to know that God is going to take care of my sons and all of my descendants. He's going to take care of the future even if I'm not here, even when I'm gone. And I think that's a great blessing for many of us who are parents. Have you ever thought, man, what happens if I die? What's going to happen to my children? What's going to happen if I'm not here to direct things? I can't leave because my kids depend on me so much. And this is where Jacob has come to a point where he realizes he's going to be gone. He's dying soon, but he's giving all of his faith to God. He's saying, you take care of them. I'm worshiping you because I know you're going to take care of my sons and their future. Look at verse 22. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. Now, this little section about Joseph is an interesting focus. The Hebrew writer brings up some points here that's really interesting about Joseph. When Joseph died, he was not buried. Like so many people who, when they die, you bury them. And that's what's been around for thousands of years. But Joseph, when he died, he was not buried. The Old Testament tells us that his coffin laid above ground for over 400 years until it was physically lifted, taken out of the land, and taken back to Canaan. And it's a very interesting witness, so to speak. It was a silent witness for all those years, for all those 400 years. It was a silent witness to the Israelites that they were going to go back to the promised land as God had said. You see, God promised them, all of you, you're going to go back to Canaan. You're going to go live in the land of the promised land. You're going to be there. Joseph had so much faith that when he died, he gave instructions, don't bury me, because I know that God's promises are going to come true, and I want to be buried in the promised land. I know God is going to deliver us to the promised land because that's what he said he would do. So don't bury me. He gave instructions to only bury him in the land of Canaan. Joseph's faith was that God would keep his promise. And Joseph's faith was a testimony for hundreds of years after his death to all those millions of Israelites. All those people that saw the above ground grave would remember Joseph had faith. Joseph believes we're going back to Canaan. He's dead, but he was preaching a sermon through that, even though he wasn't physically alive. Anytime a child saw that above ground grave, they would turn around and ask their parents, why is that grave not buried? What's going on with that? And of course, that would provide the opportunity for the parent to then say, that was a great man of faith by the name of Joseph. And he didn't want to be buried here in Egypt. He has so much belief and trust in God that he believed that he would eventually be buried in the promised land. And so he gave instructions not to bury him here, but only to bury him in Canaan. And so it was a way to even teach the young ones about how you need to have faith in what God says. God is going to one day lead us back to the promised land. Joseph's faith in God's promises influenced many generations to come. And it influences ours even today. And so when we look at these people of faith, I have questions for you. Are you living in faith? Are you letting it be seen? Abraham, Sarah, Joseph, Jacob, all these people, Isaac, they all lived in faith. They all made massive mistakes in their life, in their journey of faith. But they all had the faith. They came to the complete faith they needed. Are you living in that faith? Are you making mistakes? Well, even if you make mistakes, are you living? Are you coming back to it and truly believing everything God says? Are you letting it be seen? Joseph let his faith be seen even after his death. Isaac let it be seen when he accepted the promise he gave to his sons. Abraham and Sarah, they lived it. You never know who's going to be watching. You never know who you're going to be influencing because of your faith. Let your faith be full. Let it be active. And let it be seen. And that is the lesson for you this evening. I hope you have a great discussion time. I hope it has been beneficial to you. Hope you've learned some things and that you have grown. And that it will be a great time for this evening in your discussion questions or in your meditation time. Let's finish with the prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you for this evening. We thank you for all that you do for us. We thank you for these examples of faith and the lessons they teach us. Help us to apply it in our life so that we can truly be people of faith. Help us to let our faith be seen. Help us not to hide it, but to let our light be shown like on a hilltop in a bright lamp so that all can see our faith and so they can touch others and so they will remember us as people of faith. And it's in Jesus' name that we pray all these things. Amen. Good night, Holmes Road. See you soon.